Welcome. I'm Hernan Murdoch. In this episode, we're going to take a closer look at engagement objectives, scope, and how we go about developing the work program. Hello, Kathleen. You have been very helpful in terms of understanding the standards, and we need your help once again. So, there are a number of standards that have a lot of content around the objectives, the scope, and a few other things. And we would like to understand them. Again, anyone can read the standards, but we want to make sure we understand what uh, the significance of these statements are, how we go about applying them,
Mhm.
and how we can make sure that whenever we have that quality assurance review, that our work papers and the whole engagement is going to meet the expectations internally and externally. So, what are some of the things we need to understand about the engagement objectives and how we can make sure that those are going to meet the standards?
Well, let's start with the first graphic. Our first standard to consider is Standard 2210 Engagement Objectives. Essentially, what I think we need to focus on is that we have to establish objectives for every bit of work that we do. It's not a matter of um, it's not a matter of choice. We have to have standards. We have to have a target and an expected place that we're going to go. So, as we've seen before, the standards have a particular arrangement in terms of standards that apply to assurance engagements, standards that apply to consulting engagements. Here we see three that apply to assurance engagements. We've spoken about risk assessment already, so there's an echo of that with 2210.A1. What might not have really struck folks is the importance of considering the probability of significant errors, fraud, noncompliance, and other exposures. Actually, I'm sure that folks are aware that we need to be alert to errors and fraud. But what I'd like to take a quick peek at is other exposures. What does that
Hmm.
mean?
Yes.
In my
Okay.
view, I'd say it means things like unexpected waste or unintentional confusion or complexity with regard to how processes work. So
Yes.
it's not just looking out for the obvious things in terms of risks or problems, but the less obvious things. So the IIA has done a good job in making sure that we are alert or we remain alert to things that might pop up that are unexpected.
Another thing that can happen is, as relates to these exposures, will be poor customer satisfaction, for
Mhm.
example, or reputation risk. So it mentions errors, it mentions omissions, and
Mhm.
somewhat tangible outcomes. But some of these other things that are maybe a little bit more indirect, but they're still concerning to us because as we look at what it calls for is for us to do it on a risk basis. So from
Mhm.
that perspective, what can go wrong or how can we find limitations to our ability to achieve our objectives? Well, if your customers are not happy, that is definitely going to get in the way. So these other exposures are also of significance and of importance to us.
Definitely, definitely. So the standards, this standard with regard to assurance work rounds out with adequate criteria are needed to evaluate governance, risk management, and controls. That should come as a surprise to no one because we've spoken about that, and it is a common sense. We're trying to make sure, as a trusted business advisor, that that there are standards using the term differently, there are criteria that could be used to evaluate how well the organization runs itself. So it goes on to talk about having leadership, management, and the board establish that criteria. If it's adequate, we have to use that criteria to in our own evaluations. So we're not going to apply a different yardstick than what leadership has established for that organization, for that part of the organization. So we'll use
The
that
thing that I
yardstick.
find,
Go ahead.
yes, and then look at the remainder though. It says if
Yes,
inadequate, we need to work with management to help establish those. So
that's
that's
right.
another great opportunity for internal auditors where some organizations may have them missing. They
Mhm.
may be undefined, uncleared, uncommunicated. So there may be a lot of different scenarios. And one of the ways I think about this is people who go to work every day and they come in on time, they leave on time, or they come in early and leave late, may even skip lunch, which I think is crazy. But anyway, you have individuals who are working and they think they're doing a lot, and maybe they are, but they're not really focusing on goals,
Mhm.
objectives. There's no metric around whether they're achieving it or not, or how short they're coming. So organizations also need to have clarity around those. So we can be very instrumental in helping individuals get a sense of purpose. We go right back to mission, vision, strategy, and so on. So if they
Mhm.
have them, we use them. If they don't have them, we work with management to help either establish them or communicate them. So
Exactly.
absolutely
Exactly.
great opportunity for us. So what else does it say? But this time now we're shifting towards consulting
So
engagements,
now,
correct?
yes. So the remainder of the graphic is about how this standard applies in consulting engagements. And these two are expressed a little bit more briefly, a little bit more flexibly, because consulting engagements can be quite varied. So we want IIA wants to make sure that we have standards that we can follow, but that they're adaptable. So
Yes.
here we're talking about objectives again. And that they address governance, risk management, and internal procedures to the extent agreed upon with the client. This is um, this is another thing that I think really emphasizes that possibility of collaboration and partnership. So the extent agreed upon with the client in a consulting engagement, there may not be a particular framework that we're going to follow. We have to build it. We have to come up with a plan to help management figure out. There may only be a glimmer of an issue, and we, because of our trusted business advisor role, and if we're trusted by management, we will help them figure out what needs to be done, and we'll target whatever area, governance, risk management, or control processes as we need to establish this engagement in a beneficial way.
Very good. Very good. So great guidance there. And as we continue looking at these topics, I'm wondering what the standards say about scope.
Right. Well, essentially what they say is we need to look at enough. So the concept of scope is sufficiency. So standard
Hmm.
2220 talks exactly about that. This scope must be sufficient to achieve our objectives. So there's a critical linkage between objectives in the previous standards and scope here in this one. So we want to make sure we think about all the systems, the records, the personnel, physical properties, including those under the control of third party. So there are things that might be
Interesting.
outsourced that are still within the sphere of internal audit's influence. That's something
Yes.
that should be, I think, needs to be acknowledged. And maybe folks didn't really appreciate that that would be the case with the kind of work that we do.
Right. And organizations have been outsourcing, especially from a US perspective in particular, a lot of their processing activities to organizations outside of their own, and cost benefits and expertise, leverages, and so on. So the question is, what kind of controls are over there?
Hmm.
And I believe a lot of that came to the surface as well as Sarbanes-Oxley started asking those questions. The act required that organizations take a look at those and factor in those exposures within their own financial reports. So as the questions started coming around, people realized that they didn't have a good understanding about what was happening within their third parties. And then we had to do it. We had SSAE 16, then later updated to SSAE 18, that now provides a mechanism to
Hmm.
help get some information, some insights. And quite often, public accounting firms will perform those reviews and provide reports that then we can use. So that's an important tool that internal auditors should also inquire about as relates to third parties, in addition to the right to audit in their contracts and making sure you take a close look at the language that the contract may include, the service level agreements. Is it just documents? Can you also visit the facilities? Can you talk to people? Do you have access to data? Make sure that you have a good understanding about those third parties. In fact, some organizations talking about fourth parties, and I remember seeing something
Fourth?
recently about it. nth level.
Wow.
So there needs to be a decision made about how many layers are you going to go. And some organizations said, nope, we are only going one level. Their contracts are written with a contractor, and that contractor is not allowed to subcontract.
Hmm.
Every subcontractor becomes a contractor. So you keep it at one level. Therefore, everybody is going to be scrutinized, if you will.
Hmm.
So I think that that is one way to manage that risk. Goes back to risk appetite. So
Absolutely.
that matter around third parties is very, very, very important.
Very
So
interesting.
as we look at how we go about looking at resource allocation, because we have the objectives,
Yep.
we have the scope of what we're going to review, and then we have to address the question around who's going to do the work and what kind of resources do we need to do the work. So, can you help us better understand what the standards say about that?
Sure. This is so important because our internal auditors are tasked with ensuring that the engagement is enough to satisfy the agreed upon objectives. So we want to make sure that, oh, sorry, my mistake. I was moving on. Um, we want to make sure that internal auditors have enough resources. So think about what resource means, that we have enough personnel, that we have the tools that we need to achieve our objectives and to set a scope that is reasonable and possible to follow. So there's going to be
Mhm.
constraints around time, there's going to be constraints around availability. So it really needs to be planned out in a very deliberate and intentional way. So, one of the ways that IIA interprets this particular standard is that we are making sure that our team, our broader team, has the right mix of skills and knowledge and other competencies so that they can do the work. And if they're not yet skilled, they need to have sufficient supervision. So we want to
Yes.
grow all our team members' abilities and skills. We also want to give them um, this is a perspective on this standard, not the interpretation that's here. But one of the perspectives on this is also that we want to give our team members interesting work and allow them to grow and identify some specialization that they might be interested in that's going to be meaningful to the audit team. So I think about things like data analytics. I think about some folks who are really, really skilled at communication, and so can we
Yes.
grow those different kinds of skills and competencies and make sure? I think here for me the bottom line is bench strength. Does our team
Yes.
have bench strength? Because the limitations of time may be that someone is working on a project somewhere else and they have the technical knowledge to do something in another audit project. But if they're really needed in one place, we need to be mindful of not pulling people in multiple directions and trying to make them engage in multitasking. That's
Very
how
good
I
point.
feel about resource allocation.
I believe that that's very important. Absolutely. So individuals having the skills that they need, but also collectively
Mhm.
within the team and also within the department. So this is a very important aspect of internal auditing, and it's one of the reasons why skill development is so important to make sure we are prepared to do the work that needs to be done within the organization. So very important for sure. As we think in terms of the work program. So this
Mhm.
brings together a lot of these elements and then gives us a bit of a map of what we need to do, how it's going to be done, who's going to do it. Is that what the work program is all about?
Yes, it's a balancing act. And I think of it in the context of project management. We want to make sure that we have a work program that's documented, that people can follow, but that also allows for a little bit of flexibility and creativity should we find ourselves encountering processes and systems that are working a little bit differently than we might have expected. So we have a standard that essentially says cut and dried, we must develop and document work programs that achieve the objectives. But for assurance engagements, it's more specific. We want to make sure that we have procedures to identify information, evaluate it, and document it during the engagement. And this is very important, it must be approved prior to implementation. And if we have any changes while we're in the field, Those need to be adjusted, approved promptly.
Yes, yes, and I like the fact that it mentions that there's a possibility of making adjustments.
Mhm.
Because in some cases, people will think that, well, the program is there, I need to do everything as it's written, but we need to be resilient. We need to be flexible. And although we do a lot of research during the planning phase, and you want to document what you plan to do, but along the way, you may find that the reality on the ground is a little bit different.
Mhm.
So, from that perspective, that needs to also feed back into the individual or individuals who oversee the engagement and have them recalibrate the work program if necessary. So
And
that's
if you
also an important
if
thing.
you also think about what the previous standard said in terms of capacity and capability of our
Mhm.
resources, we don't want people to check their brains at the door just because we've crossed the threshold into field work. Let's use our abilities. Let's question whether or not these are the best ways to do things and make adjustments as necessary. If it's going to make us more efficient and more effective, then I
Right.
advocate for making changes and getting them approved. Toot sweet.
Yes. What I always told my teams was to be on the lookout. And yes, we'll work as best we can to put together the best program we can. But when you're doing the review, always pay attention to what's really happening and if things are consistent with expectations. And if not, what do those things mean? And another important piece here is a communication among team members so that if you see an anomaly, relay that back to your we talk about it as a team when we do our debrief sessions and our status updates. So what are you seeing, what are you seeing, what are you seeing, and we compare notes so that we can then go back and see if there are any patterns that are emerging that will then warrant a change to the work program, and then we proceed once again. So that continuous evolution as we go all the way through and try to give the client something that is going to really wow them, which is kind of the goal that we always say we put ourselves aiming for, which was let's tell them something they don't know. Let's be helpful as we go about doing our work. And the standards also say, as far as consulting engagements, that they are more flexible. Is that correct?
Correct. So the consulting standard here on the graphic does make that exact point. Work programs for consulting engagements may vary in form and content depending on the nature of the engagement. So with assurance engagements, there's usually a template that is then filled in with the details. Might be a different template in the case of consulting engagements. I would argue that there's a bit of a service level agreement flair with consulting engagements, so as to make sure that the boundaries within which we've decided to work will be very, very clear, and there'll be no mistaking that we're still internal auditors. We may be working in a different fashion, focusing more on efficiency and effectiveness of some process or system, but the flexibility of the program is allowable by our standards.
Excellent. Very good. Very good. So, yes, this has been very helpful so that we have a deeper understanding of what the standards say. So, thank you very much for helping us better understand the objectives, the scope, resource allocation, and how we go about developing work programs that are going to be flexible. Well, number one, fixed enough so we have a good plan before we start. We want to
Yes.
plan for success, but also adaptable if necessary. So, thank you very much, Kathleen.
My pleasure, Hernan.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit-related content.